Hi everyone, this is Intro to Africa at Flagler College with Dr. Young. Um, Today we're going to talk about the political situation in the colonial era, sort of between, say, the First World War and the Second World War, maybe going back a little bit before that. Uh, this is this topic will allow us or force us to delve into some concepts that are actually quite complex. So hopefully the discussion here is at least somewhat clear, and I'll try to simplify as much as I can. And if you have lingering questions, as you probably will, please ask those on the discussion board. We can try to work through this in that way. Trying to figure out a topic to start on is tricky here because there's really, there are a lot of different and disparate forces at work in the colonial period in Africa. And, uh, and so this is not necessarily in any particular order. The first thing I want to discuss here, though, is the rapid evangelization and Christianization of Africa in this period. The work of European missionaries really began to bear serious fruit, by the last couple of decades of the 19th century. And huge numbers of people became at least nominally converted to Christianity. Now, there is a difference certainly between um, these two words or these two phenomena. Evangelization refers to just the initial exposure, and this was the work of these missionaries. They would go in, find people who were willing to convert to the faith, or at least to say they were Christian, and perform, the rituals that are part of that, usually baptism. And these people became Christian, right? And these missionaries would form them into churches. Of course, that doesn't mean that they changed their behavior or, in larger terms, their culture to fit with Christianity. That's something that took a long time to bring about, and arguably, even in areas that have a lot of Christians in them in Africa, all the way to the present, still are undergoing the second phenomenon, which is Christianization. And that refers to the wholesale cultural change, where the entire culture begins to transform to reflect the values of the religion. Now, this is a phenomenon that is not just germane to Christianity. We could talk about the Islamization of Africa, for instance, and talk about the initial phase of conversion and then the process of cultural change. And so these are the Christianization is much more of a gradual and evolutionary thing, right? Now, the thing about the evangelization of Africa is it was accompanied by, in most cases at least, a process of education. Missionaries provided a Western-style education to those who would attend their churches and the schools they set up. And in many places in Africa, this was the only Western-style education available anywhere. Even, for instance, in southern Africa, where there were, a large number of European settlers, the European settlers themselves often didn't make any effort to educate the native Africans. And they left that in the hands of missionaries. And so in South Africa, the Afrikaners in particular had no interest in educating Africans. They thought that they were, they, often enslaved them or treated them as little more than chattel slaves. And so there was really no need in their mind for education. All they needed to learn was to obey their white masters. The British were a little more friendly to education in that setting, but the most successful and longest lasting schools in South Africa were missionary schools. Fort Hare in the Transkei, which is a region right on the kind of southeastern tip of South Africa, was the most prolific of all of the schools in this era in South Africa. some of the products of Fort Hare include figures like Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu and Oliver Tambo and some of these leaders of the African National Congress about whom we will discuss later in the course. Sorry, pause for a drink there. Now there are, we're talking about politics here and not the process of cultural change and religion and things really. But one thing that should be noted is that often recent converts to Christianity were particularly zealous. In your reading of Things Fall Apart, for instance, you will see this. There is a character named Enoch who becomes particularly zealous about his Christianity, even to the point where he tries to actively challenge some of the traditional culture of Umuofia. The zealous converts can have a real impact in impressing others to join them. They tend to be the most eager evangelizers, as it were, proselytizers. But they can also be an annoyance to those who want to maintain the traditional culture, as you'll see in Umuofia. The village elders, as it were, do not like, rather in Things Fall Apart, the village elders of Umuofia do not like Enoch, and they're even considering taking action against him. This can, in a way, drive a wedge into communities and create a divide. And these divides religiously tended to happen along generational lines. And they did so not just because the religion was the force here, or maybe not even primarily, but because there were already strained tensions between the generations in many parts of Africa. And we've talked about this, in areas where there was polygyny, for instance, which was, a lot of Africa. Older, established, wealthy men would have their first pick of all of the available bachelorettes, as it were, or young women. And they would often sort of snatch up the young women who were peers of their sons. And, this created some tension in the community. And that was mitigated to some extent by the age rank systems and the rituals like circumcision, which removed these young men from the community for a time, sometimes months at a time. But that tension was still there. Well, Christianity took those tense settings and blew them wide open, right? As young people in particular tended to convert to the religion in this period in larger numbers than the older people. We could also talk about gender divisions here. Women tended to convert more readily than men did, for instance, right? So, so this is going to have a real impact, and it did have a real impact on many communities where young people found some kind of liberation in Christianity, or people who felt oppressed in some way would find liberation through this new religion, even if their knowledge of the religion was rather scant. As with the spread of Islam into Africa and the earlier manifestations of Christianity in places like Ethiopia, the Christianity of the colonial period among the native Africans was syncretic, right? They mixed traditional beliefs with Christianity, and there were many Christians who were not satisfied with just taking the Christianity sort of from the hand or directly from the mouth of the white man, right? Instead, they, accepted Christianity but wanted to become separate. And so this period also sees the formation of a number, in fact, a fairly large number of independent Christian sects in Africa. And some of these were quite successful. Again, I'm going to use a Southern African case, but in the 19-teens and 20s, there began a Christian movement in South Africa under the segregationist Union of South African government among the black population there, among the native Africans. And it was called the Zion Christian Church. It eventually split into at least two, and maybe more than that. I'm not absolutely familiar with it. I know of at least two sects. But this was very much traditionally African. The worship services involved a lot of singing and dancing, often sort of mimicking or taking as their inspiration traditional African dances. There were, they created these uniforms and formed this strong community that functioned as a way to protest the oppression of the colonial regime, or in the case of South Africa, the segregationist regime. When I lived in Southern Africa in the 1990s, the ZCC, or the Zion Christian Church, was, I think, easily the most prominent of all of the Christian sects, at least among the native African population there. There were people who, we would see them every day, right? They wore these badges and pins that identified them as members of that church. I occasionally saw them headed for religious services. I never actually attended one of their religious services. I'd really like to do that, actually, but saw them heading for that. They were dressed in uniforms. The women wore these blue dresses with their pins and badges. The men wore these kind of white jumpsuits, and they even the shoes were sort of uniform issue. Large shoes for doing that functioned in the traditional African dances, which included a lot of stomping and things like that. And the Zion Christian Church was very much a protest church, and it also had an apocalyptic dimension to it. The leaders of the church preached that the last days were upon us, that the second coming of Christ was imminent, and that God had declared that their church was to free the African people from the oppression of the European, right? And that this is what God wanted, that they were in fact the chosen people of God, and their liberation would be brought about in preparation for the second coming of Christ. And that's just one group, one manifestation. There are lots of these all across Africa, often lacking even a building to meet in. I have seen pictures of and known people who've seen these things of plaques placed on trees that decree in different parts of Africa, decree that this is the meeting place of the such and such church, right? And there's also starting in the era of independence in the 1950s and 60s in particular, some communication between these traditional African sects and the evangelical, the black evangelical churches in the United States and perhaps in other parts of the African diaspora, that they kind of draw inspiration and momentum from each other. So this is a phenomenon that really is important to talk about in the political context of the colonial era, because it's one of the main ways that African people had to form communities that would be accepted. I mean, because these are Christian, nominally at least, the Europeans were willing to kind of let them meet and do their own thing, but it gave them a community in which to voice their grievances and talk about their hopes for a different world. And from these congregations, in many cases, we have other political action emerging. Of course, education and literacy has a real influence on the political life of this period, but because the intelligentsia, the educated, tend to become, at least in many places in Africa, the leaders of the newly formed political parties. But across Africa, there was a varied educational infrastructure, meaning that in different Africa had now been carved up between different European countries, And even among the territories controlled by one power, there were different levels of commitment, as it were, right? And so, depending on the policy for one particular region or colony of Africa, the European power might institute a program of education, build schools and hire teachers to go there and educate people. But in other places, they might not pay any attention to this. This would be of lesser or of no concern to them. In general, the British tended to have a slightly more robust educational infrastructure than, say, the French or the Belgians, though the Belgians eventually did commit to at least primary education for many of the children of the Congo, though they never got around to anything like universal education. Maybe only at its height, about 30% of all of the young people would receive primary education, but the Belgians also made little effort to see to the secondary or much less the higher education, whereas in British and French territories there was more of an emphasis on maybe a little less primary education in kind of sheer numbers or percentages, but more of a commitment to secondary education in places where there were schools, and a larger number of students leaving Africa to go to universities in Europe or the United States. And so over time, from the mid 19th century on, there are schools, either missionary schools or government schools, public schools, and in some cases private schools, actually. And over time, at least a few of these educated people, particularly the university-educated people, came to form what we might call an African intelligentsia, right? And in some places, this was more of a force than others, obviously, so there's great variation. The problem with the African intelligentsia was they didn't have much of a defined place or role in the colonial society, because with the institution of indirect rule, which became the most common way to deal with the wielding of power on the regional and local level in Africa. And we've talked about this, talked about Frederick Lugard, the British colonial official who instituted indirect rule, and mentioned that this involved the co-opting of chiefs, right, of traditional African leaders, often with the mistaken assumption that they were essentially the unquestioned rulers of these territories, that the Africans had a kind of totalitarian, or not totalitarian, but dictatorial system, right, or autocratic system, and that was usually far from the case. But the colonial powers tended to commit to supporting, sometimes even propping up, the chiefs, right? And the chiefs didn't necessarily receive this education. They were older. They had come of age maybe before the education was widely available. The African intelligentsia tended to be younger, and so they were trained. At least the colonial regimes tended to educate people because they wanted. They operated under the assumption that Africans would be grateful for the education they had received, and they'd become committed to, the whole European culture, the European way of life, and that they would be then loyal servants in the colonial cause, that they would serve as translators and as middlemen, and some of them certainly did, but there were only so many positions like that available. And so, we have emerging here an African intelligentsia that's restless, right? In some cases, they formed political parties or started to work for political action in other ways. And, many of these educated Africans began to clamor for a different kind of education than they had received, because they were taught a European-style education, including an education in European history. If Africa was treated at all in history classes or in classes about culture, it was, with the assumption and even kind of the outright spoken idea that Africa was inferior, that it needed to be conquered and enslaved and manipulated by Europe because Africans were still savages, right? That was the rhetoric that even these educated African kids were learning or were hearing, and they didn't believe that, right? They wanted African history from the perspective of Africa. They wanted to, learn about and contemplate and celebrate their own ways of living. And so, the law of unintended consequences is really an operation here. That the Europeans educated Africans thinking they would get people committed to the colonial regime, and instead they created a monster. They created the most discontented of all of the African population, a group that was clamoring for change, right? And so in some cases they formed political parties, in other cases they began to start their own publications, their own newspapers or magazines or journals or whatever it was, and to use these as outlets to call for political change, to call for independence, to call out the hypocrisy of the Europeans, and to begin to foment nationalism. Now, nationalism is a phenomenon that bears talking about. It obviously has a huge impact in this period, and I will discuss it at some length here as we in due course as we move along. But suffice it to say that nationalism is a modern phenomenon. We really can't talk about African nations previous to the 20th century. There was no such concept, right? The medieval kingdoms of West Africa, for instance, or Great Zimbabwe, or some of these other things we've looked at, are not nations. These are kingdoms or political entities of a different sort. A nation is a modern concept that fuses the notion of territorial sovereignty and integrity with the idea of a people, right, and of a culture. That the link between a national culture and a territory really is the essential recipe for nationalism. And this is something that was formed in Europe in the 18th century. Possibly a little with some antecedents before that. We can begin to talk about the stirring of nationalism probably as early as the late Middle Ages, though I would probably challenge that too ready an attribution there. But with the French Revolution in the 18th century, for instance, with even the English Civil War back in the 17th century, we begin to get the stirrings of nationalism and the strong concept of the nation, right? And over the course of the 19th century, especially with the formation of Italy and Germany as independent nations, out of kind of a patchwork of different territories and principalities and duchies and counties and things like that. Nationalism runs its full course. The rest of the world was a little bit behind that, but nationalism begins to have a real impact in Africa in the colonial period, in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, as these African intelligentsia absorb these ideas and modify them to fit the African situation. Now, we and these terms are not original to me. One way I had it explained to me when I was actually an undergraduate student was that nationalism took different forms. Initially, people in colonized regions, and this is the case for Africa, it's also the case for, say, the Middle East or Southeast Asia or other places, tended to be interested in and call for their own nation along the lines of Western European nations. The term I have heard applied to this is parliamentary nationalism, because, of course, the political structures of Western Europe were parliamentary in orientation, and that's the case especially for Britain and France, right? Not necessarily for Germany or even Italy, and certainly not for anything in Eastern Europe. But parliamentary nationalism, where there were representative institutions, democracy of a sort, though, there, even in this period, there was not universal franchise in Britain or in France, and definitely not in the United States, right? Because women didn't have the vote yet. And so, that's the kind of nation that these African intellectuals were calling for. But as that was denied them repeatedly over time, they began to look to other national models, right? In the 1930s and 40s, for instance, some of these nationalist movements began to take inspiration from the fascist regimes of Europe, Italy and Germany, Nazi Germany, right? Or probably more influential was Soviet Russia or the Soviet Union. And the term I've heard used for this, and I'm not sure this is kind of universal parlance, but I think it helps, is totalitarian nationalism. That is, nations along the lines of the Central or Eastern European models, where there aren't representative institutions, where there's more of a kind of autocratic style of government. And so, as the parliamentary nationalists fail to make any headway in their desire for independence for their own nation, they begin to opt, or the next generation opts, for a different model of nationalism. So let's look at one example of this running its course. And by the way, this doesn't mean that they immediately turn to fascism or communism. In some cases, that was the ultimate result, as their other calls for reform were denied them. But the totalitarian nationalism could also take other forms, and we'll see that in the case of Egypt here. All right. So let's look at nationalism in Egypt. This is one of the places where there were a number of intellectuals who attended European universities, got an education. This goes back to some of the reforms of Muhammad Ali Pasha as early as the early 19th century, and they did form political parties. The most prominent of these was led by a fellow named Saad Zaghloul, who is pictured here on the slide. It was called the Waft Party. And the Waft Party, like the African National Congress in Southern Africa, sent a delegation to the Versailles Conference asking to be heard, asking for some inclusion and recognition in that conference at the end of World War I. And like the ANC, they were totally denied that, right? They didn't get any sort of recognition as a representative body from the Versailles Conference, who considered Egypt to be ruled by their king, with a British protectorate established over it. Now the British did technically grant Egypt independence in 1922, though this was a conditional independence. In other words, what really happened here was they declared that the protectorate was over, and that there was no longer going to be this kind of Egyptian, or this British governor of Egypt, who acted as the real power behind the throne of the king of Egypt. But with that independence grant, they still reserved, the British that is, reserved intervention rights, is what they called them. And this was they were especially concerned about the control of the Suez Canal. right? That was the chief thing that Britain wanted. They also wanted, you know, the best deals on cotton and other products that were coming out of Egypt. And so they said, we will reserve the right to intervene if we think that this whole independence thing is not going well. If Egypt is in danger of falling into chaos, we will sort of reestablish control for a time, right? And so with independence, the British, you know, called for, or they organized an election, a parliamentary election, though they also said that the king didn't necessarily have to listen to the Egyptian parliament, that he, you know, that there wasn't much of a, I mean, there really is no separation of powers here. The king could effectively veto whatever the parliament wanted to get done. So this is how the British set up the system, because the king was one of these indirect rule figures, and was, you know, the British at least considered him more easily manipulable than than the Egyptian parliament would be. The Waft Party won huge sweeping victories in the 1924 parliamentary election in Egypt. And knowing that the Waft Party was unfriendly to British interests, the British put a lot of pressure on the king, who was in their pocket, of course, and he dissolved the parliament and declared those elections to be invalid, right? And so there was a time where the elections were not recognized. There was no parliament seated. They had more elections. And actually this kept happening between 1922 and the early 1950s, when there was a coup in power and Gamal Abdel Nasser came to the fore of Egyptian politics, something we'll talk about later. There were, I think, 4 occasions where the British pressured the King of Egypt to dissolve the parliament because its makeup was not friendly to British interests. And so the British are effectively still ruling Egypt here, though technically Egypt was independent. And with Parliament not working to the, to serve the needs of the Egyptian people, there were many who even became disenchanted with the Waft, who were trying to work through these parliamentary channels, but kept being thwarted in their efforts to do that. And so this leads to, or this is one of the kind of catalysts for the formation of what is known as the Muslim Brotherhood. The guiding force behind this was a guy named Hassan al-Banna. In the late 1920s, this party was formed. And this is not, sort of Eastern or Central European style of totalitarianism. Rather, the Muslim Brotherhood takes their cues from Sharia law and called for the institution of a Muslim-based political system with Sharia law as the law of the land, right? And the Muslim Brotherhood has been really consistent for now 90 years calling for that same thing, and has been one of the great forces in Egyptian politics ever since, though often oppressed and silenced, but maintaining a very loyal and strong following nevertheless. Okay, so we'll come back to the Muslim Brotherhood and see its evolution, or rather its relative consistency in its kind of political program. There were those who followed in the footsteps of Saad Zaghloul and the Waft Party. In Tunisia, for instance, around the same time, a guy named Habib Bourguiba formed what was known as the Neo-Destour Party, and sought parliamentary elections. And Tunisia goes through this same process where they try to get parliamentary elections, and the French, who were ruling over Tunisia as a colony, really are unfriendly to anything that the Neo-Destours were trying to do there. Now, with this political upheaval, the economies of these North African nations suffer, right? There's too much corruption here. The British are still way too involved, and have terms that are unfavorable to the Egyptians, essentially free access to the Suez Canal, and the best deals on Egyptian cotton and all of that. And so, their inability to govern themselves due to British intervention leads to an economic decline, and this is exacerbated by the Great Depression and other things. Okay, to make things more complicated, on to another topic. So, getting away from the case studies here. The term tribalism is, and I said at the very beginning of this course, I don't like the word tribe. I think that it has too many negative connotations. Tribe is not the same as tribalism, okay? So let me try to simplify this, all right, and explain what this is and what impact it has on the politics of Africa of this period. The word tribe was used by the colonial powers to describe the politics of Africa. They assumed that all these Africans were organized into tribes, the tribes had chiefs at their head, and that the chiefs were effectively autocratic rulers, right? And, for purposes of administration, census taking, and, taxation and all of this, the Europeans tended to, of course, count people. And one of the ways they did this was to assign people to a particular tribal identity, right? And, this was problematic in areas where that sort of identity, where ethnicities were more fluid. Take Rwanda, for instance, which we brought up a number of times already. There were, of course, these divisions between the pastoralists and the farmers, which roughly corresponded with these ethnic titles of Tutsi and Hutu. But those categories were very fluid in, when the Africans were kind of left to themselves before European intervention. But for purposes of governance, the Germans and then the Belgians, who took over after World War I in that area, needed partners, needed to co-opt, what they saw as the legitimate or national or natural rulers, and so they began to really crystallize these titles in place, assigning them to people as a kind of inviolable part of their identity, making them carry identity cards that stated that they were a Hutu or a Tutsi, right? And so, not surprisingly, these African people began to embrace these titles, right? In some cases, at least. And it didn't stop there, right? I mean, so these tribal identities were assigned in some way. I mean, they were based on in most cases, I think, on actual existing identities. But those identities, like I've said, have tended to be more fluid before the Europeans, needed to assign identities to the Africans. And as they were carrying around identity cards and being forced to label themselves, Africans began to embrace those identities. But tribalism goes beyond that, okay? Even in local organization, on the local and regional level, in, for instance, trade associations, which were formed, and we talked about these, I think, in the last lecture a little bit. People used these tribal identities, these markers, as a way of getting commitment from people. So they would say things like, well, we're all Zulu here, or we're all Xhosa here, right? And we need to organize ourselves so that we can fight for what is ours, right? And so they embrace these things as part of forming these other political action groups or organizations. And so, the European desire to divide and control along tribal lines and to use these tribal identities as a way of instituting indirect rule and all of that led to increased African political agency here along these tribal lines. Now, this is happening at the same time as, with the missionaries and the intellectuals, and the formation of a literary culture was beginning to come to the fore in political life in Africa. And in some cases, even these intellectuals embrace these tribal identities, right? In their publications, for instance. And the missionaries, of course, had labeled people by their tribal identities. And so, these intellectuals had absorbed these labels to some extent, and some of them pushed back against those labels, certainly. But many, embraced these labels and used them as a way to call for, independence movements, wrote about them as, in ways that tried to get people to buy into something. This is just, in so many ways, a new manifestation of the same kind of politics that we have seen in Africa going back centuries and millennia, right? Where this just provides an incentive for people to join together. Just like age rank systems and title taking systems and markets and things like that had done this in pre-modern African societies. These tribal identities got people to commit to a community. They were, in many cases, self-chosen. I mean, we have to see African agency here. This isn't just something assigned to them by Europeans. Africans actively embraced these labels because they felt that this would enable them to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish politically, right? But we also have to acknowledge that these labels are to some extent artificial and ahistorical, that these are new things, even if they emerged from existing systems. That, when run through the kind of machine of nationalism here, that they're transformed into something new, right? And so, I mean, political identities are really in flux here, and I mean, this is an exciting time in African history. As these new groups are coming to the fore, and people are calling for change, calling for common action against Europeans, calling for Africans to rise up and claim what was theirs and all of that. And in the process, they embrace these labels that in some cases had been, partially assigned to them by the Europeans. It's a similar phenomenon to, what we see, what we've seen over the last few decades, I think, in, say, African American culture, or the culture of various minorities in the United States, where, in some cases they have taken even very pejorative labels and embraced them as their own. Because, if, say, I mean, the N word, and I'm not going to say it on this lecture. I find it an ugly word, obviously, but the N word has been embraced in some parts of African culture, because it's okay if I identify, I as an African American, speaking hypothetically here, embrace this label and use it to refer to myself or my friends or whatever, because this is more authentic. Well, that's what's happening to some extent in Africa with these ethnic labels or these tribal identities. The geography of political action is what I've labeled this next part here. All right. Nationalism did not take hold in most of Africa, meaning, this is something that took a long time for people to wrap their minds around, because collective action on the level of a kind of super regional institution, or form of some kind. Sorry, I had to think of the right word there. Was not something that had been done much in Africa. I mean, apart from these fairly large kingdoms and empires of the medieval period, most African, political forms were of relatively local or regional taste, right? That was far more the norm than a large and complex kingdom like Ghana or Mali or Songhai or one of these things. Even the Sokoto Caliphate, it really was just a loose collection, a kind of confederation of these emirates and even smaller entities than that, right? And so nationalism was going to take some time to have an impact, right? Whereas on the local level, chiefs wielded power under these indirect rule systems, but intellectuals often, sought to impress upon the minds of people on the local level the desire for change and reform. Now, so there's the old adage that all politics is local. That is particularly the case in Africa, because people didn't even often have a sense of the size of Africa or even the size of a European colony. They were familiar with their local circumstances, and that was it, right? I mean, we can see some of these tensions, by the way, in the book we're going to read next week in the course, The Dark Child. And to some extent, we can see this in a little bit in Things Fall Apart, right? Where, the Europeans are having conversations with the Africans, and they're talking about, the kingdom of England or of Britain. And I mean, the Africans are just confused by this. They're like, well, you live in a land far away. You have your own, king or queen or whatever it is, and they don't, understand that the British are actually involved all over the world, and they have this kind of super territoriality to them. Okay. Now, the exception to this, to operating on the local level, were some of these intellectuals who had gone abroad, had gone to the United States or gone to Europe and gotten a sense of the size of the world, for instance, and in some cases in many cases actually, had connected with people in other parts of the African diaspora, representatives, intellectuals from the Caribbean or from, from the U.S., African Americans in the U.S., all of whom, had a sense of kind of historical oppression by Europeans, some of whose ancestors had been slaves, for instance, right? And so, there's this whole almost global intellectual movement that is embraced by some of these African intellectuals, right? The picture here on the slide is of a Caribbean intellectual named Aimé Césaire. And if you take a class on in the English department on, say, post-colonial literature, you'll definitely encounter Aimé Césaire and Marcus Garvey and some of these other intellectuals. Césaire and others talked about this concept of negritude. I would try to pronounce that with a French accent, but I'm just going to say it with my standard American here. It is a French term, right? Later, the Southern African intellectual in 1960s and 70s, Steve Biko, who we'll talk about later, he calls this black consciousness, okay? The sense of a common cause among all black people across the world, right? Negritude, the Negro identity, as it were. And so some of these intellectuals embrace this idea. They want to link up their political action with people in the Caribbean and the United States and maybe the African diaspora in Europe, and fight for the rights of black people all over the African diaspora and in Africa itself, right? And so these intellectuals tend to embrace this idea of superterritoriality. They want to take action on the level of the mass collective, globally, or at least all over the African continent, right? And this superterritoriality has a real impact on this whole generation of African leaders who emerge in this period, who were educated in the colonial period, and who become the leaders of many of the independence movements in the next period, right, in the 1940s and 50s. Kwame Nkrumah in the Gold Coast, or what became known as Ghana, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya. These are all proponents, or rather students, of the concept of negritude and superterritoriality. And, you know, as early as the 19-teens and 20s, figures like this were calling for this black consciousness and this mass collective action on a global scale. And so nationalism doesn't necessarily gain much traction among them either, because they're thinking along broader lines. However, many of them come around to the idea of nationalism as a kind of intermediate step to their larger goals of achieving a kind of pan-African consensus and a pan-African independence. All right, I know that this is complicated. I hope that this is coming through with some amount of clarity. Now, nationalism is not just, I mean, it does certainly involve opposition to European control, right? But there's something more about nationalism, right? That this gives Africans a voice, that it will allow them to do African things in the way that they want to do them, to embrace some of their native traditions and to kind of form politically along the lines that are more natural to them, right? And so nation is much more than, I mean, the concept of nation and the whole these nationalist movements are more than just a way to protest. They're calling for a different style of education that acknowledges African identity and that acknowledges the validity of African history. They're calling for education to allow African people to write their own stories, to form a literary culture. Spin-offs of this include figures like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye and others, who become the first novelists of Africa in the 1940s and 50s. And so this nationalism is a kind of all-encompassing thing. It's both political and cultural at the same time, and those components of nationalism feed off of each other. The Europeans were opposed universally to Africans embracing nationalism. And here we can sense the rank hypocrisy, right? Europeans did this, or their rhetoric at least was, nation is a concept that was invented by Westerners and is for advanced civilized peoples. The Africans are not yet civilized or advanced. They are going to take some time to get there, and they must do this under European tutelage, right? And so, and that's going to take some time. In the European mind in this period, they embraced the idea that Africans would eventually be ready for independence. But it was going to take a very long time. They were probably talking about a century, maybe 2 centuries, right? I think if you were to, go back to, if you come up with a time machine, still waiting for one of my students to invent one of those, right? Please let me know if you do. I really want to take a ride on it, have some interest in lots of periods of history. Anyway, sorry for the distraction there. If you would take a time machine back to the 1920s and talk about Europeans who were involved in the colonial venture and ask them about the possibility of African independence, they probably would say, oh, well, eventually. But that, we're talking a couple of centuries from now, probably, to get these people out of their state of savagery and, eventually to civilization. So the European timeline for independence was very lengthy and very open-ended, right? Not necessarily with a defined set of criteria. It was just the process of cultural change to make these people fully Christian and fully civilized, because in the European mind, those two things went together. This is going to take, a century or more, maybe 2 centuries. Now, European governments were really willing to grant elections on a very limited scale with massive amounts of European oversight and almost with European veto power, as these nationalist movements and these intellectuals were calling more and more for change and for, independence and all of that. You know, the Europeans wanted to kind of throw them a bone, as it were, something to appease them, but that was tightly controlled. And so the local and regional elections of, say, they started kind of in the 1940s, were often manipulated by the Europeans so that their chosen leaders, usually the indirect rule chiefs, were sure to win, right? And if they didn't, they probably would stuff the ballot box and make sure they won, or they would manipulate it in some way. If there was an unexpected result, they would declare that that was invalid, that there was election fraud or whatever, right? And so even these the grants of local and regional elections were done in a way that, by European design, would not threaten the status quo that was dominated by Europe. All right, last couple of concepts here, rather briefly, and more, toward the timeline, less conceptual than what we've been doing so far in this lecture. Again, if you have questions, I know that this has been a complicated discussion. If you have questions, please bring them up on the discussion board, and let's talk about them there. The Great Depression did have a profound impact on Africa, though in ways that I think were probably different than the impact that was felt in other parts of the world. And in some ways, the Great Depression, in some areas of Africa, probably in the localities, in the rural parts of Africa, the Great Depression probably didn't manifest much. The Great Depression does see industrial decline, which impacts Africa in numerous ways, right? Because, of course, Africa was treated in the colonial era as a place from which to extract raw materials that could be shipped back to Europe and transformed into finished products in the industrial sectors of the European economy. Well, with the decline of industry in the Great Depression, there's a much less demand for these raw materials. The price drops, and Africans who were kind of caught up in the system of cash crops and other things that were feeding industry were, out of jobs and really out of these economic opportunities. And because they were so dependent on the Europeans for even their basic sustenance, I mean, those who were working in the cash crops were not growing their own food, for instance. They were waiting for the Europeans to send, dry and canned goods to them to eat. With the decline of all these things, Africans had to go back to what they were doing before. And so, to some extent, there's a return to the traditional structures. People who were involved in the cash crops take up their lives as independent farmers again, right? But at the same time, now that the colonial regimes were in place, the colonies were treated as places that could be used to bolster the flagging economy of the metropole. And so the Great Depression era saw an increase in taxes levied against people living in the colonies in order to support the economy of the metropole that was in shambles. And these Africans didn't have the resources, the money to pay their taxes in the first place. The increased taxes were a tremendous hardship. And so, many Africans often did what Africans were wont to do in cases like this. They took to the land. They moved. They tried to get away from the colonial officials who were trying to collect their taxes. They avoided. Now, both Britain and France and probably Portugal and Belgium and other countries, in some cases, did put more of an investment into the colonies because they realized that the raw materials coming out of the colonies could be used to kickstart their economy. So some parts of Africa do see an increased commitment to the infrastructure and things like this as a way of jump-starting the nearly dead Western economy. Right. So the effects of the Great Depression are varied, but profound nevertheless. Right. The Second World War was what rescued the world from the Great Depression. I mean, ultimately, there were, the New Deal in America and things like this did bring about some change, but the Second World War was a pause in just about everything, almost worldwide, right? Um, and Africa played a really important role in the Second World War, actually multiple roles. It was a theater in the war, a really quite important theater. Arguably, if Adolf Hitler had put more emphasis on taking Egypt from Britain, the war might have gone differently. And I know that there are a lot of scenarios. If he had put more into the U-boats, for instance, in the Atlantic, and really hurt the British Navy, the war might have gone differently. Or if he hadn't withdrawn some of the troops from the Eastern Front and really put everything into Stalingrad, then the war might have gone differently, right? So there are a lot of these what-if scenarios, and thankfully none of them came to pass, and the Allies were able to win that war. But the North African theater was important, right? The British were defending, often desperately, their hold on Egypt because controlling Egypt gave them de facto control of the Suez Canal, and also enabled them to maintain hold on the precious oil fields of the Arabian Peninsula. And control of oil was a major factor in the war, right? The whole reason for trying to sweep down via the Blitzkrieg into southern Russia was that there were massive oil fields there, right, in the Caucasus region. If the Germans had won Stalingrad, they would have seized the petroleum reserves of the Soviet Union and had been able to use those things to prosecute the war more effectively against the rest of the Soviet Union, and certainly against the Allies more, right? At the same time, if the Germans had overcome Britain and Egypt, they would have been able to take possession of the Arabian Peninsula and have come into possession of oil there, right? So the battle for oil really is what a lot of this was hinging on. The British were able to win some key victories, the two battles of El Alamein, for instance, in Egypt, against Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, as he was called, the German general. And the Allied invasion of the western part of North Africa, of Algeria, Tunisia, and places like this, enabled, this was a kind of first step in the Western Allied advance. As they retook North Africa from the Germans, they were able to use that as a jumping off point to invade Italy in 1943, and eventually secure their supremacy in the air, and stage the landing at D-Day in June of 1944. Right. So, and for that matter, Eisenhower and Montgomery and Patton. The Desert War in North Africa was really important for their kind of overall plans, their overall strategy, and these generals spent, put a lot of thought into all of that. So that's the kind of battlefield war that Africa played in this. There were skirmishes in other parts, but the other parts of Africa. But the Germans, for the most part, were they were out of Africa. After the First World War, all of their territories were taken from them. The Italians in the 1930s were finally able to take control of Ethiopia in 1936, but the British managed to evict them from Ethiopia in 1941, and that was really kind of the last Axis hold on any part of sub-Saharan Africa. North Africa, of course, was a different story. The Europeans ran up massive debts, meaning the British in particular, but the French as well, right, ran up massive debts over the course of the war and in the reconstruction after the war. Most of these debts were to the United States, and so this left these great colonial powers in a weakened condition, and they were no longer able, at least, for the French it took some time, but the British sort of realized this right at the end of the war. They were no longer able to maintain these far-flung colonial enterprises all over the world in the way they were able to do that with ease before the Second World War. So these crippling debts of the war would have a great impact. Like in the First World War, there were lots of African conscripts. You can see here a shot of at the top of the slide, top left of the slide, of African soldiers fighting in the war. Some armies did not allow Africans into certain roles, often not into combat, but others did, right? The South Africans who joined with the Allies against the protests, by the way, of many of the Afrikaners who wanted to join with the Germans, who again felt a greater cultural tie to the Germans and embraced many of the racial ideas that the Germans had in this period. But the South Africans supported the British, but at the same time, they did not allow black African conscripts, certainly not in any kind of combat role. They did allow them into more of the supporting roles in the British Army. But there were conscripts, and some of these conscripts came home from the war with, again, this notion that Europeans were vulnerable, that they were not superhuman like many of them had been led to believe, and some of these conscripts would then enter into political action in important roles. There was food rationing in Africa during the Second World War. The colonial powers, like as they did at home, rationed food and took a lot of the foodstuffs away from Africa to feed the troops. So Africa felt the impact in that way. The war led to massive inflation, and that had an impact on Africa. Prices for food and other things rose. And then, and we'll talk more about this in the next couple of lectures, but the colonies were thought by some of the powers, France in particular, but the British to some extent, recognized that the colonies could play a role in Reconstruction, that the raw materials and riches that came out of Africa could be used to help rebuild the metropole after the tremendous destruction of the war. And of course, Africans began to resist this and say, we are not here to serve European interests. We want to do our own thing. And now that these empires were in a somewhat weakened condition, these calls for independence began to gain real traction. And with the formation of the United Nations, Africans began to have more of a voice, and the UN began to put pressure on these European powers to divest themselves of their colonial enterprises, or at least to come up with a plan for a transition to independence. Europeans are still thinking along very long-term lines here, but at least there's movement in that direction, and this lends strength to the nationalist movements in Africa, and begins to have a real impact. Okay, so we will move on next time and start to talk about the quest for independence, and eventually get into the independence movements and their success in the 1950s and 60s.